Good morning and welcome to the Morning Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Mike Ham, coming to you as always from the Spotlight Studios in Morristown, New Jersey. We've got another great guest. That's all we have on this show are great guests. So our guest today is a retired Air Force officer, an entrepreneur, a real estate investor, and the founder of Ideal Wealth Grower, Axel Meierhoefer. Axel, welcome.
Yeah, hey, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's great to have you on. So let's learn a little bit more about you. So you're a real estate investor, you're an entrepreneur, retired Air Force officer. Take us through some of that stuff. So how did you get yourself to here sitting with me on my show, basically?
Right. Yeah. Well, in a nutshell, as you said, I was in the Air Force as an officer, and one of the things that comes with that is you're being moved around quite a bit from different location to a location. And I had, from my early upbringing, always thought it would be a good idea in most cases, if you can somehow swing it, to purchase a property rather than rent a property. And so that was always the goal. But then on the flip side, every so often when we were actually being moved around, it wasn't always the ideal time to sell a property because markets go up and down, and the military doesn't necessarily look at, is it opportune for your real estate to be sold right now or not,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So they move you for other reasons. And so we ended up in a situation several times where it wouldn't have really made much sense. So we kept the house, got another house, which is a beautiful thing with the VA at the time. You can get VA loans and stuff like that, no down payment, all those kind of things. But what it actually did is ultimately it got me into this whole idea of how do you actually manage your real estate. Not, I don't mean in a physical property management way, but like you having properties. Sometimes we had two or three, then we sold one because the market was better and stuff like that. And then when I retired, I started a consulting business. And besides this sensitivity to, okay, how should I actually manage my properties? I also became aware that as a business owner, you don't really have a retirement plan.
Right.
Right. And so I asked myself, okay, what would I do? What would make sense for a retirement plan? And I got into a couple of different areas that all said real estate, which we already had kind of dabbled into. So I guess there was a certain bias. But
Right.
it also indicated real estate would be a good way if you could actually grow a portfolio. And so I did this since I started my business, my own business in 2005, kind of like just for the family, just for ourselves, just to develop passive income through real estate. And a couple of years ago, we did a pretty significant 1031 exchange because we had from this moving around one property in the Santa Barbara area that had really increased a lot in value, but it never really performed as we would have liked to. So when the market kept going up, I thought, okay, this is really the time, right?
Right. Now's
And
the
so I
time. Yeah.
pulled the trigger, did the exchange, and told other people about it. And they said, wow, I didn't even know this is possible. And how did you do it? And with this many properties and so forth and so forth. And ultimately from that came, well, maybe you can tell other people that they can do something like that as well, especially when people realize that we live in California, but all our properties are out of state. And that was something a lot of people said, I didn't even know that you could do that, right? And
Right.
so that's how we grew the portfolio. And ultimately I said, okay, to educate other people and give them information if they're interested, or maybe mentor them, make my relationships to lenders, insurers, turnkey providers, and so forth available. I just start something a little bit more formal, and that's how idealwealthgrower.com and the whole site and all that stuff came together.
Right. So how long were you in the Air Force for?
22 years. It's been a
Wow.
while, but I was in for 22 years. Yes.
That's a long time. So and then you were moving around, like you said. So where were you bouncing around to? Throughout the United States, I'm assuming.
Well, I mean, the thing about it is I'm probably a very unique case, let's put it this way, in a neutral sense, because I actually initially joined the German Air Force and was stationed in Europe in different locations, first in Germany and in Sardinia, for example, and a short time in Spain. And then from the normal kind of evolution, I got into test flying, and all the little black boxes that go into these modern planes, or most of them, at least in the NATO environment, are made typically by American companies.
Okay.
So when you're in test flying and the new system is supposed to be integrated, they send you to the company to get training so that you, as one of the first people who can actually test it in a real plane, know how it works and what the engineers came up with. So we came to the US a bunch of times, and my wife at the time said, do you think it would be possible to stay longer than just 4 or 5 weeks for a training? And I looked into that and found out that was actually something, and I think it still exists. It's an officer exchange program where you literally take off your everything you have and you basically join the other service. So I became basically, as a German Air Force officer, the assistant director of operation of a fighter wing on the US Air Force side.
Okay.
And from there, a couple of things happened that would probably take too long and to go into details. But normally this kind of deal is meant to be like maybe 2 years or 2.5 years. And in my case, due to the circumstances, I had spent probably about, at the time, 12, maybe close to 13 years on the German side, and then came over, became a US Air Force officer, and then these other things all happened. I spent basically 7 years on the US side.
Gotcha.
At the very end, when I retired, the question was actually, is my pension going to be paid by the US Air Force or by the German Air Force? But I had a little more on the German side, so they're paying the military pension, which is a tiny amount if you don't stay until you're like 50 or 60 or something, right? But a little bit. And so, yeah, I'm in this kind of unique case where I've about a little more than half of my time in the German military and the other half in the US military. So properties, to answer your question, we had a property in Clovis, New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico, like I mentioned, Santa Barbara area, and then here in the San Diego area. So those were like locations here in the US. And then we also had 2 properties in Germany.
Okay.
Before we came over here.
A little international real estate investor over here.
Yeah, unintentionally, but yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you ever fly it? Like, what was like the coolest thing you flew?
I would.
We're gonna get into real estate eventually. I'm just so invested in this.
It's actually 2 different things I would mention. The one thing was flying with the Tornado, which is a European-made plane. And that had what's called terrain following radar, right? Like nowadays, a lot of people talk about Tesla and autonomous driving and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, and you have to think about, this is like probably about like 1995. We had a system that you could engage the autopilot at 200 feet above ground at a fighter jet speed at night and fly matching the contours of the terrain. And since after my test flight time, I became an instructor. That always freaked out the students, like,
I mean, it would freak me out. Just the idea of it would freak me out. Right. Fighter jet speed and just, going like this the whole time.
Yeah, we were going about 10 miles a minute and at 200 feet above the ground. So that's pretty freaky. The other cool thing that I was allowed to do is the Congress at some point decided that the F-111 was too expensive a plane to maintain. And so in the last 6 months when that plane was still in service, we were asked to deliver a lot of the weapons that were specifically only made for that plane because you couldn't transfer them over to any other plane. And in the context of that, there was one specific thing where you would fly a maneuver that gets you extremely high into the atmosphere. So we topped out, I don't want to waste too much time on it, but we topped out at about 57,000 feet,
wow.
Right, which is really high, which I think when you said what was one of the coolest things, it's partially the plane, but it's also just being that high, you actually literally see the curvature of the earth, how thin the atmosphere is, and the plane starts behaving kind of like sluggish.
Yeah.
And one thing that I remember from the briefing that blew me away is the cone, the tip of the plane itself was made out of a composite material, and you had to limit the maximum speed coming down from this high altitude to not overheat that composite material in the nose because of the friction that it would create. As you get lower and lower into the atmosphere, the friction gets higher and higher, and it basically starts heating up. And in my mind, I still have this picture of what would happen if you ever went too fast and that nose
just burst into flames. Yeah.
or just like disintegrate or something.
Yeah, right.
So, but those things, being that high, and I oftentimes still marvel about these pictures they show from the ISS and stuff like that, right? Astronauts up there, or a rocket, like a SpaceX rocket ascending, and you see these pictures nowadays with the cool cameras they have on, and each and every single time literally reminds me of that particular flight where we were as high as I've ever gone.
Yeah, right. Very cool. All right, so we'll get into now. We're going to get into what you actually came on here to talk about because I
Okay.
mean I actually didn't know about the Air Force thing until I was reading more on your bio and stuff,
Right.
and I had to
Oh
ask.
yeah,
So,
totally. Yeah.
um,
Fun
and
times.
exactly, yeah, very cool. All right, so real estate. So let's talk about you mentioned that you were moving around quite a bit, kind of picking up properties almost as you went and got moved
Yeah.
around. So then you make this transition into investing in real estate as a career. So take us through like the types of investments that you make and like how you set them up and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Like, so one thing that happened is towards the end of my career, we got more into places that are inherently more expensive. I mentioned we ended up from one of my very last assignments with a house in the Santa Barbara area. We now live in the San Diego area and California, or you could basically say almost up and down the coast. What you find is, and this is a little bit my German heritage. I look at a lot of things from an evidence and data based view, which when I really started to get into real estate investing for a serious thing, not just as something that happened kind of coincidentally. One of the terms that I don't hear that often, and I think that would be probably very interesting for your audience, is the term performance. So I looked at it as to say, okay, when I make an investment, and you find this for stock market stuff all the time, but not so much and not so often in real estate, for me to say, okay, when people talk about the performance of their stock investments, it's totally clear to everybody. But on real estate as an investment, it's not that often heard, or it's only talked about in the context of how much did it increase in value. I bought it for this and I sold it for that. So for me, performance, and this is really one of the criteria to get into this, is I want to apply what's called the 1% rule, which means if I buy $100,000 property, I'm making $1,000 rent a month. And when you try to do this in California, like in our area here around San Diego, you don't really find anything reasonable as a property, single family property like 3 bedroom, 2 bath or anything like that, below 5 to 600,000. So that would mean you would actually have to get somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 in rent per month, and nobody is paying that. Just because, mainly because there are not that many people who could afford it. You would have to have like $15,000 income per month or something, right?
Right.
So the performance isn't there. So I looked at what can I do to have performance at that or even a better level, and I learned that it is very important not to just look at that number, because you could lower your criteria of where the property is, how downrun it is, how high crime rates are, and all of that, and then ultimately work your way to 1% or maybe 2%. But as soon as you say, I want a nice, highly freshly renovated property in a nice area with good economic balance, with low crime rates, with all these additional points, then it gets harder and harder. And what I found is right now, at least, the number of places in the country that offer that is gotten smaller and smaller, or less and less, you might say. And most of our properties are now in the Midwest, because that balance between meeting the 1% rule and having all these other criteria still met, there aren't that many places anymore. So we have some properties in Ohio, in Idaho, in Illinois, in places like that, and we're looking right now into Alabama. So that's basically the main thing, is to answer your question, how do we get started, is by saying, okay, where can we find performance?
Great. Okay, so then you find a property that it fits your criteria. How do you go about because you're in, like you said, you're in the San Diego area, and if you're going to buy a property in Alabama, like you said, I mean, how do you make that work? I mean, because you have like
Right.
boots on the ground there. Do you have do you actually go out and see the property yourself?
Yeah, so what I found out is I looked into different options. Could I work with an agent? Could I find a property management company? And through my military history that we went through earlier, I always was initially in the area. And then when we left, they were already established. They knew me. I had personal relationships. Now, when we went into this more investing stuff, I didn't know anybody in these places. And
Right.
ultimately, I decided, and I've always operated this way as a military officer, as a business owner, now for ID Westbrower. everything is really revolving around the quality of relationships. And so what I decided is, and what I'm offering through Ideal Wealth Grower as mentorship and relationship referrals basically, is to use turnkey providers. So the turnkey provider is a company that actually identifies a property, renovates it, and then manages it after they sold it to you, or to me in this case, and or to anybody in your audience. And that is basically, for one, a good thing, because I only really work with a handful, like 5 turnkey providers, and I vet them against a whole bunch of criteria. And then it's similar to what I had before, these kind of trusting relationships. But there's also something, if you're interested, that we can touch on what are the criteria to find these providers,
Yeah.
and why does it work versus there are hundreds of turnkey providers that don't work.
Right. Yeah. What is some of the stuff that you look for?
Well, the thing about it is, what you find when you just fundamentally go out into the market and say, I would be willing to work with a turnkey provider, this term turnkey, what it originally should mean and what it means for me is, somebody finds a property in the market that they are really familiar with. They have a crew that renovates this property. Then they put it out for a fair price so that they still make a little bit of money on it, but not outrageous. And then as soon as they sold it to an investor, their own team is managing that property on behalf of the investor. And what that does, when you do it that way, and those are the only turnkey providers we work with, when they screw something up in the renovation, then you can be assured that when the tenant moves in, like I buy it and then the tenant moves in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months later, that lack of quality will show up. Well, so in my criteria, part of it is that the turnkey provider has to guarantee their work for 1 year, and they have to guarantee the rental income for 1 year. So as property managers, they need to do a good job selecting suitable tenants. And as the renovation organization that originally renovated the property, they need to make a good job renovating with good quality, because otherwise they have to pay for anything that needs to be fixed that they didn't do right during the renovation. And when you apply those criteria, you will find a lot of so-called turnkey providers. They find the property, renovate it, sell it to you, but they're not managing it. Right. Or they have properties that somebody flipped or renovated, so they bought the property, they mark it up a little bit, sell it to you, and then manage it. Or they only have a management, and then you can choose from all the properties in the area, and when you find one, then they manage it for you. And they say, well, the turnkey is, we find you the title company, we find you the lender, we manage it for you. So the interpretation and definition of what they call turnkey versus what I call turnkey is quite different. But it's important to have these dependencies. I call that a virtuous triangle. I, as the investor, want to be a winner because I buy a property that is reasonably valued and that meets the 1% rule. The turnkey provider, as long as they are on the renovation side, have every incentive to do a good renovation and then get a fair price to make a first little profit for that part of the deal. And then they need to also be good in the property management, because that benefits the tenant. No tenant wants to be in a property where constantly something breaks because the renovation was done kind of mediocre. Right? So the tenant wins because they get a nice, freshly smelling like a new car property that they move into, and they get high quality because the turnkey provider would be kind of quote unquote stupid not to put high quality, because then they have to pay in the first year for everything that goes wrong.
Right.
So those three parties, the tenant is a winner because they get a nice property. The turnkey provider is a winner because they first make money on the sale and then they make money on the management. And I'm the winner because it's really, really hands off. And all I do is spending a few hours a month across like 10 properties to check in and see that everything is working as it should.
Right. Okay. So you have properties, all over right now. How many are currently in your portfolio?
We have a total of 10.
Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. So I want to get into, Ideal Wealth Grower and how basically you've used your experiences from the real estate investment side. And I'm sure part of it is, your background in the military and all that kind of stuff. Take us through like how Ideal Wealth Grower works and what you try to help people with.
Right. Yeah. So one thing, it starts out with to say, I'm interested in residential real estate investing, but I don't really necessarily know exactly what to do yet. I just kind of start getting my feet wet. So what for that, I would recommend to, look into our YouTube channel, read our articles, follow us on Instagram and so forth, because on that end, on that just providing valuable information, we're trying to put out, valuable content on a regular basis. Every day of the week, there's something new in this field coming out from us. The next level then is to say, okay, if I find that I'm a little bit like on the kind of scared side, I'm not really quite sure what to do, if I'm really in the right frame of mind, my next recommendation, I offer this to your audience, go to ideawealthgrower.com/free and download the mindset menu. And so the mindset menu goes through all the things that might make you a little queasy or not quite sure, is it the right thing for you? And really takes you through to identify, where am I? Where do I want to go? What are my goals? How do I go about it? And how can I get myself in the frame of mind so that it's an energetic, a positive and exciting thing and not something to be afraid of? And what I've started recently that anybody can do now is I'm actually offering a video series on YouTube that you print out or take down the manual from the website, and then you can follow on step by step. We're at episode 7 or something like that now, that really explains every step in the manual. So again, ideawealthgrower.com/free. And then the next step would be to say, okay, so now I know I want to do this. I realize that even if I live in an expensive area, I can do this in other areas. I can find these. Now, how do I go about it? And that's where the mentoring comes in. And so people can go on the website and they can make one or two decisions that we offer. One is to say, you can get a mentoring package that explains all these things that we just briefly touched on today. And I introduce you to my connections, because one thing in this whole game of real estate investing that I found is ultimately it comes down to relationships. So I work with a nationwide lender that helped me to get these 10 properties. So you can imagine, if you were coming to me and say, Axel, help me, I would say, okay, let me introduce Michael to you guys on the lending side. They know they have 10 mortgages with me, right? So they treat me and you a little different.
Right,
Same
exactly.
thing for the insurance provider, same thing for these 5 turnkey companies. We work together on how to identify properties. So that is about a 6-7 months program. Or you can say, I can see, and this is the ultimate goal that I always hope to work with our mentoring clients, is to say, if you come on the path, on the journey to reach what I call economic independence, then it's a longer term thing. And instead of saying, I want to charge you over and over and over and over for mentoring sessions, there's a one fixed lifetime package. You can get that on our website. And then, you and I would be connected for however long we want to be. Naturally, the frequency is high at the beginning and it may be tapering off, but there's a one-time fee and then we're done. And so this then leads to economic independence. I define that at the point in the future where you have the freedom to decide if you still want to exchange time for money and go to work, or if you want to do things that are not really money related. And where you say, I've always been passionate about art, but I know that it doesn't pay very well. Or I want to help other people, but that is a more a charity type of thing. Well, if you know, like in my case, that the money comes in from my properties every month, no matter what I do, then that's really that economic independence where you say, my economic needs are met by my passive income from real estate. So now I have the freedom to decide what I want to do. And if you love what you do, then keep doing it.
Right.
But having the freedom to make that decision is a totally different thing than being dependent on having some source of income other than passive, so that you can actually pay your bills and have your life and so forth. So that's ultimately for anybody who says, okay, I want to really change my life. I went through the mindset manual. Now I really want to get fully engaged in this. Then that would be the first major milestone, is reach economic independence. And depending on where you start, how old you are, how many reserves you have, it can be done in like 7 to 8 years for most people that have very little yet. I would say about 12, 13 years. And it's a fun ride. It sounds maybe like a long time, but you have to keep in mind you're only doing it once. And then it's not just for you and for the rest of your life. but it's for your kids, for your family, for their kids and their family. That level of equity, those assets that you have, those 10 properties that I have, they're going to go over to my daughter, at some point, and then she has every opportunity to turn them over to her kids. So you're not just building a passive income stream, you're really building a legacy.
Right. Right. So how do you get there? Like, so you talk about economic independence. So how do you go, like, someone like me who I don't invest in real estate, I would like to one day probably. So how do I get from like where I am now, taking that first step? I go through the mentoring and all that kind of stuff. Like what are some of the first steps that I would have to make in order to get started on that path?
Okay, yeah. So what we do in the very early steps is to say, let's take a look at basically your balance sheet. What are all the things that you currently pay for? And on the other side, what is currently an income coming in? And any other things do you have for 401k? Do you have stocks? Do you have any other things where you could either have equity, meaning value in it, or you have a regular income? And so one thing that oftentimes occurs is when we really challenge the things that we currently pay for. I'm the first to admit to myself, I didn't even pay attention. People were saying, cable cutting is a good thing to do. So I got Hulu, Amazon Prime, and Netflix. And when I talked to somebody and saw the same thing, and I said to that person, hey, Frank, do you really need all three? And he said, no, I never even realized that I had all three. Then as soon as we finished that call, I looked at myself and said, man, I have all three and I shouldn't have that, right? So
right.
So really going through and saying, okay, what are the things that you're spending money on, and is this smart? And then also looking at where do you have obligations, right? Does it make sense to have a $600 a month credit line for your car or credit cards that you're paying? So we want to optimize first. How is your balance sheet looking? And then the next step is to say, create what I call an accumulation account for two reasons. The things that you used to pay money for and don't anymore, like you settle on Netflix and that's it, and you get rid of the other ones. Those $15, $20 that may not sound like much, they shouldn't just go into your pocket. They should go into this accumulation account. And the second component is what I call pay yourself first, or the 10% rule, which means any money that comes in on the other side of that balance sheet, 10% at the moment it comes in should go into the accumulation account. Now, Dave Ramsey says when you're younger, like under 30, you should actually do 15%, right? So that's debatable, but I say at least 10%. And the goal, and this is the important part when you're looking at what's my mindset is, I try to convey to people that the goal is as quickly as possible to get somewhere between 16 to 20,000 in this accumulation account. Now, if you have a spouse, a wife, or a partner or stuff like that, then that would count for both of you together, because that's around the amount of money that you need to get an $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 first investment that meets all those criteria we touched on before. Right. And that's really, really important. And I hope this is also for your audience. A lot of people think, oh, I need 50,000, 100,000, 150,000 before I can ever really do anything in real estate. But keep in mind, 80% of the money comes from the bank and only 20% of the money comes from you. So if you buy an $80,000, $85,000 property, your own part is $16,000, $17,000. The rest is other people's money, the bank's money.
Right. It's always good to use other people's money. That's always great.
Exactly. Well, so that's on the front end, right? If your goal is manageable, it's achievable. I mean, if you say you have two people and they somehow through like balance sheet and other stuff can do $1,000 a month. In 16 to 18 months, you're ready for your first property. If you have nothing right now, in 16 to 18 months, you can have your first property, right? And keep in mind, we only buy properties that are cash flow positive, meaning like they have money left over at the end of every month, even after the mortgage and insurance and everything is paid.
Right.
So now you're getting $200, $300, $400 from that first property that also goes into your accumulation account. So it's not going to be another 16, 18 months until you do the next one. It's probably maybe like 11 or 12 months for number two. And then it may be 9 months for number three. And then you can get to a point where you buy 2 a year or even 3 a year. Right? So when you say, how do I ever get to 10, 15, 20 properties? It's a matter of getting started, and it's a reasonable amount, and then it accelerates from there. And ultimately, the number of how many properties are we talking about is really dependent on how do you define your economic independence number? If
Right.
you say, I live in an area where I believe I need $4,000 a month to conveniently pay everything that occurs in my life or my bills and stuff like that. Well, if you make, let's say, $300 on average from the properties that you own, then that's basically somewhere around 12 properties, 12 to 13 properties, and you're at your 4,000, right? If you need either more or you get $400 per property, which some people say, well, how can it be this different? Right now, we're living in this awesome area or time where mortgage rates are so low, but rents have not really come down. Actually, the opposite, rents have been increasing. So the difference between the insurance, the mortgage, and the property tax versus how much rent you can get has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So I have more than 300, 350, sometimes $400 positive cash flow now for brand new properties, where a couple of years ago it was maybe $200.
Right.
Right. So all that together, if you really think about it, is don't look so much at $5,000 a month, 20 properties, $1.5 million in equity. That's great for the vision. But for the immediate, when you say, how do I actually get into residential real estate investing, is let's review your balance sheet. Let's identify the areas where you can, from already existing money, put some of it into your accumulation account. Then number two, pay yourself first 10% on anything. Number three, is there anything that you could do that could maybe increase your income side, like any kind of gig or anything that you could do? Put that into your accumulation account, and then don't look at massive amounts in the future. Look at the 16, 17, 18,000 that you're working towards.
Right.
Because then when you see, your account 3 months in has $4,000, a couple more months in has $7,000, you can literally count the months until you're ready for your first purchase.
Right.
And we help you naturally to all the steps, including how to find properties that turnkey providers offer. Now, people that work with me have one big benefit due to these relationships that I have. Turnkey providers tell me, we have a property that fits your criteria coming up. And there's always the choice, either I can take it if I'm looking for another one to add to my portfolio, or any one of my mentoring clients who is getting ready can take it, and they basically benefit immediately from the existing relationship. Right. Because no turnkey provider we work with would want to screw up that relationship, because we have multiple properties with that.
Yeah, right. You would lose all that business. So, yeah. So there has to be some risks, right, in doing this stuff. I mean, there's risks in everything. Like, what are some risks that you see from like this type of real estate investing, maybe from your experiences, I guess?
There are the biggest risk on first glance, first thought, when you ask that question, would be that you make the decision, which everybody is free. I would never force anybody to work with a particular turnkey provider or anything like that. That you either say, okay, I find my own turnkey provider, or go one step further and say, I do this on my own, because it's kind of like jumping in a shark-infested pond. And yes, you may survive, depends on how you actually look like when you come out again. But that's the biggest risk, right? There is, and I'm not saying this to brag, but I mean, you're running this for a while already and have had plenty of guests and different perspectives. There's a lot to learn, and a lot of that stuff that needs to be learned is kind of hidden in the details, right? If I give somebody, and I'm sure lots of your audience members have bought houses for themselves.
Right.
If I were to say, okay, let's sit down and look at your closing statement for your own house that you bought and go through in detail, and you tell me if you're really aware of all the things that are in there, let alone doing this for an investment property, right? But there are risks, for example, if you don't have anybody who helps you, that they basically put in a clause that says unpaid property tax is the duty or task of the buyer. Right. So depending, and I know this from some Midwest states where I got like the 2019 property tax bill in March of 2020 for the whole year.
Yeah.
Now I make sure when I deal with title companies that the seller made sure that everything is up to speed up to the day that I buy on taxes, but they don't have to. And if they have a smart seller, they say, well, why don't we let the buyer pay for that? So you thought you bought a beautiful $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 property, and a month later you get a bill for several $1,000s for unpaid property tax. that kind of stuff, right? So those are some of the risks. Is if you don't work with well-established, really well-vetted partners, then either you have educated yourself for all these details, or you better have somebody on your side who can make you aware of all the things that could happen.
Right.
And there's plenty. I mean, another quick example, and then we could go on for hours, but another quick example is insurance, right? We are all aware, we see the commercials, Geico and Farmers and State Farm, and I'm mentioning them just because they're familiar. I have no dealings with them. But the problem is, as an investor, when you really say, when would I go to an insurance company that to repair something, would have to have a major thing, like a major failure of the property. How likely is that for something that has basically been completely renovated from the ground up when you buy it? So what you want as an investor, as an insurance policy, yes, it's required, your lender requires it, but you want to have as high a deductible as possible. Most of these really big insurers only allow you to go down to $2,500. We work with one that allows us to go down to $5,000. Because if it is something that was not caught by the renovation, then it's the responsibility of the people who renovated it, because I have a written warranty, right? So why would I pay a policy that is way more expensive if I don't have to, because it makes no sense? And think about it. That policy is more expensive, and what does it do? It takes away from your positive cash flow. Right. So the more you can get a good balance. Balance is the biggest thing in this game. It's a good balance between your relationship to the title company, your relationship to the lender, your relationship to the insurance company, where we say, yes, we all want to live and we all want to make a profit, but it needs to be fair. It needs to make sense. Yep. Not just because you're a multi-billion-dollar insurer, you just don't allow any policy to go any further down than 2,500 deductible.
Right.
And so those are some of the risks. And if you try to do it on your own, you either have to be willing to spend the time to learn the stuff, or you need to be willing to take the risks that come with not knowing it and then just hoping that stuff works out.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So, all right. So one of the things that I thought was interesting when we did our introductory phone call was just the mindset side of this. Right. And, we talked about a lot of the technical stuff. We kind of got that out of the way, I guess, and, how people can actually do it. But obviously it takes a big, there's that commitment level. And I know looking short term is obviously a lot better than looking at the big picture. It's if you're going to eat an elephant, you got to start one bite at a time. You can't eat the whole elephant all at once. So take us through some of the stuff that you help people as from a mindset standpoint.
Well, one of the things that I find, and I'm a little sad about it to be honest, but what I oftentimes find when I talk with people, even way before they ever decide to work with us or get into mentoring or stuff like that, is that when you listen to them describing what they have done with their money and what they're maybe doing with their money, or what goes on in their life, or how their work is working, or any of those kind of things, it sounds like the description of a victim. I'm basically the victim of my circumstances, the victim of my choices. I'm basically in this situation because of all these external influences. And what I'm trying to get across to people is to say, even though that might be what you're saying, and you may not even be that aware that that is what you're basically saying, but if I had to boil it down, it oftentimes sounds like a victim behavior. And what I want to get people into is what I call a creator mindset. I'm creating my own future. I'm creating the investments, not by building them myself, but deciding which ones do I want to go in. I'm creating this economic independence number because I have educated myself to find out what should it be. And if you say right now I live somewhere like, let's say, in Mississippi, but I really want to live in Florida, but then you should know how much does it cost to live in Florida, and then that determines your number. But the creator mindset gets you into a positive frame of mind and into positive energy to say, okay, I create my future. The first thing I need to create is a good balance sheet. The next thing I need to create is an accumulation account. The next thing I need to create is some knowledge that I can get either through what Ideal Wealth Grower does or others and your podcast and so forth to educate myself and get better. So I'm creating basically the knowledge, the confidence, the energy, the positivity, all those kind of things, so that I actually feel I'm part of the journey. I really have influence. And ultimately, when you ask me, why do you do residential real estate investing? I would say, because I like to have control over the stuff that I own.
Right.
Rather than putting money in a 401k plan and then some mutual fund advisor somewhere is somehow doing something with my money and I don't even understand what's going on, right? So getting yourself into this mindset of the creator, of your own path, of your own journey, of your own results, that is the first biggest step to take. And it's not just you flip a switch and suddenly you are a creator. It's some work that you need to do and some steps you need to go through. And that's what I'm helping people with.
Right. And then, so, I mean, I'm assuming that if people are coming to you, that's like a good first step, cause like you're moving yourself in the direction of going down this path. Do people ever, kind of get to a point where they kind of, like there's a frustration sets in, I guess, early on, because, we're talking about, the first steps and getting yourself started and all that kind of stuff. And then, I know it might take a little while for that second property to come and the third property to come and eventually reach that economic independence that you talk about. Do people ever just say like, this isn't for me? Like, I can't do this, and then you kind of help them through that?
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting because it's almost like black and white. First, a lot of people feel almost like they're being accused for not having accomplished what they really desire. And they get into somewhat of a little bit of a defensive posture, right? Where they say, well, but there is this reason why this hasn't happened, or there's another reason. And I felt this car needed to happen, or I thought I needed to haul stuff all the time. And this credit card debt that I have there is because of these 12 good reasons and stuff like that. So it's almost like constantly defending, which goes into this direction of the victim mindset. And what I'm in that phase, oftentimes I'm almost like the cheerleader, almost like to say, don't worry about it. It's not really that important why it happened. It's more important, what can we do about it to turn it into something positive? And then after a while, when we get actually into this creator, energetic, positive energy mindset, and especially when people have purchased the first or second property, it's almost like a little bit like an addiction. Then I have to start reining them in.
Right. Yeah. Going too fast
suddenly,
at that point.
yeah, suddenly they want to, oh, when can I get the next one? And I thought about it, wouldn't it be smarter if I go into multifamily, or should I basically do storage units? And just so you know, I'm never telling people you have to do what I say or you have to only do this one thing.
Right.
I'm trying to educate them to make informed decisions. But this is sometimes, also another important component to consider is people, if you look in the world in general and say, okay, what makes people successful? Why is everybody admiring people like Warren Buffett or Bezos or Elon Musk or these kind of people? And I think the one common denominator is that they decided something for themselves, knowing that it's going to take a while, and then they stayed the course. And that's kind of what I try to do, because I believe it's easier to stay the course, even if I'm guiding a little bit on a particular direction, when you have somebody to do it together with, rather than having to do it yourself. And I mean, we have all been there. People said rockets can never land when they have been shot into the air and now they land. People
Right.
have said, selling books is dead. Amazon will never be a company. Well, look what happened to that, right?
Yeah.
And so on. There's a lot of examples. People said electric cars will never work. Well, Tesla now is the highest valued car company in the world or something like that, right? So when you look at not so much the result, but what did these people do consistently over quite periods of time, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years, is they made a decision. And even though there were like ups and downs, lefts and rights, they stuck with the path. And that's why I say, first you get to convince people this is kind of the skepticism to get on the path. And then when they actually start accelerating, you kind of have to hold the reins a little bit so that they don't run too fast, because the faster you run, the more dangerous it gets.
Yeah, exactly. All right, cool. So we're going to move the show into our closing segment. We call it Under the Spotlight. We basically, the people that have been listening to this episode have been listening to us talk for the last 45-ish minutes. What is, maybe we touched on it already and you just want to reemphasize that point, maybe something that we missed that you want to bring up. What is one thing that you want the listeners of this show to walk away with?
Well, the one most important thing that I tell all my mentoring clients and also would love for your listeners to think through is you don't need to have huge amounts of money to get started. Think about 15 to $20,000 and what you can do by yourself or with help to get to that number from your accumulation account, and that allows you to become a real estate investor, not rich people stuff or so forth. So if you can take that away, and maybe as a second or 1.5 thing is to say get yourself into a creator's mindset in positive energy rather than the victim that is being influenced by all this negativity. So if you become a creator in your mind, naturally more than welcome to take the mindset manual from our website for free. So get a positive mindset and become aware that the initial step to become an investor is not massively big. It's somewhere between 15 and $20,000.
Awesome. Great. Well, that was awesome. So that's going to wrap up our show for everybody listening. All the stuff that Axel referenced, I am going to put all those links and everything in the show notes, the email addresses, the websites, the Instagram accounts, the LinkedIn stuff. Everything will be in the show notes to make sure that if you are interested in Ideal Wealth Grower and learning more, you go to use those resources that Axel has. If you want to be a guest on the Morning Spotlight, or if you want to hear us talk about a specific topic on the show, make sure you go to themorningspotlight.com or email us at themorningspotlight@gmail.com. Axel, thank you again for coming on with us today. This was great.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks for making the time and letting me be a guest on your show.
Absolutely. And everybody else, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.